and I'm sure people will trickle in as as the clock ticks past 8:30 in the morning. Well, good morning, everyone. I'm Professor Stephanie McCurry from Columbia University, and we are here for the early session, Black Women at War, Gendered Dimensions of Anti-Slavery Warfare. I think I speak for all of us on the panel when I thank you for your dedication, and in some cases, I'm sure, personal loyalty in signing on at 8:30 in the morning. We certainly do appreciate it. The scholars on this panel have 3 amazing papers. You will not be sorry. The way we are going to proceed is I will introduce the 3 of them to start with, and then they will go in order of the program: Adam McNeil, Adam Thomas, and then Kellie Carter-Jackson. I will give a short set of comments, and then we will open it up to the audience. So, and the audience, just in terms of procedure, if you have questions, please write them in the chat. And when it comes time for the Q&A, I will read them out and we'll proceed that way. The panelists, some of them might share their screen during their presentations, but we've tested that and hopefully we're all set to go. So let me introduce you to the 3 historians on our panel this morning. Adam McNeil is a PhD candidate in history at Rutgers University. He focuses on Black women's lives during the Revolutionary and founding eras in the Chesapeake Bay, which his paper is about today. His research has been supported by fellowships from the University of Michigan's Clements Library, the David Center for the American Revolution at the American Philosophical Society, and the Omohundro Institute of Early American History and Culture. Adam hosts the New Books in African American Studies podcast, by which many of us know him, and the Omohundro Institute podcast on fresh histories of the American Revolution. He also blogs for Black Perspectives and the Junto. Adam Thomas, who will give the second paper, earned his PhD at the University of California, Irvine, very close to where I had my first job. He is currently assistant professor of history at Western Carolina University, where he teaches early American, African American, Caribbean, and Atlantic world history. Dr. Thomas's current project compares 2 1831 slave uprisings, one in Virginia and one in Jamaica, and focuses on their place in historical memory and their effects on contemporary politics. His work has appeared in the Journal of Global Slavery, Slavery and Abolition, Black Perspectives, Women's Studies Quarterly, and the Journal of Caribbean History. His book on the 1831 Emancipation Wars is under contract with UNC Press. Kellie Carter-Jackson earned her PhD at Columbia University. Yay, Columbia. She is currently associate professor in the Department of Africana Studies at Wellesley College. Dr. Carter-Jackson's 2019 book, Force and Freedom, Black Abolitionists and the Politics of Violence, won the James Broussard Best First Book Prize and was a finalist for the Frederick Douglass Book Prize as well. She is also co-editor of the volume Reconsidering Roots, Race, Politics, and Memory. Her essays have been featured in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Atlantic, the Guardian, the Los Angeles Times, and on NPR. Dr. Carter-Jackson is also a commissioner for the Massachusetts Historical Commission and historian in residence for the Museum of African American History in Boston. She co-hosts the podcast, This Day in Esoteric Political History. You can follow all 3, or should I say all 4, of your presenters on their Twitter accounts. So with that, let me turn it over to Adam McNeil, who will give us the first paper. Adam.
Wonderful. Dr. McCurry, thank you so much for that great introduction. I forgot all those things happened in the past year and a half in terms of supported by and all that. So before I begin, I want to thank you, Dr. Kellie Carter-Jackson, Dr. Stephanie McCurry, and Dr. Adam Thomas for letting me on this panel, like graduate student, PhD candidate, all that good stuff. And it's a real pleasure. I had a great opportunity to hang with Dr. Thomas over the summer when we both ventured down to Southampton to view the amazing sites that are still kind of eerie because of how similar it seems that they were to the antebellum era. So it feels great to also be on the panel here today. And Dr. Kellie Carter-Jackson, hearing about the Museum of African American History is great because, as you know, I used to work there. And so it feels good also, hear everything that's going on with you post this amazing book that I got the opportunity to interview you for. So, and Dr. McCurry, it's great to finally meet you in this virtual person, too. Heard a lot about your work and read it for a good bit now too. And so it's also a pleasure as well. And so, and I also do not take this lightly. And although I wish our panel were taking place in person, I am thankful to God that President Hahn and the rest of the Southern Brain Trust decided to host the 2021 conference virtually. I know that decision was not easy, but this was the best decision in the interest of the health and wellness of all Southern members and community members in New Orleans due to the ravages of COVID-19. Now, time to discuss what brought us into this virtual room. Black women at war, gender dimensions of anti-slavery warfare. As you just heard, my paper title, as you would have seen as well, is not Black Women, Freedom, Politics, and the American Revolution. As they say, letting the archive speak to you is what really brought me to a different topic. And so my paper today is actually entitled Advised Him to Go, Black Women's Wartime Resistance and Survival in the Chesapeake during the War of 1812. There's been a lot of amazing work done on the American Revolution in terms of wartime resistance, but this actual piece is actually a part of what is forthcoming in my dissertation, which is going to be the 4th chapter. And so despite the change in war, the War of 1812 still provides an essential episode in early African American history to consider the gender dimensions of Black women's warfare in the Chesapeake Bay and how the struggle challenged the institution of slavery in the region. My remarks today, I should preface, are part, like I said, of my larger dissertation project. I will not go with him, Black women's wartime resistance in the Chesapeake during the American Revolution and War of 1812. And so my dissertation focuses on how Black women in the Chesapeake resisted and also survived slavery during the American Revolution and War of 1812, two periods that provided enslaved people immense opportunities to self-liberate and relocate with the British. And this is where I have to give a big shout out to Dr. Vanessa Holden, also a Rutgers grad, of course, for her amazing book, Surviving Southampton, which really, I had to take some time because it literally, as we see Dr. Thomas is up there, it literally kind of changed how I think about this project. Although her project is a little later, it still has so much to say for so much of how we think about slave resistance and enslaved women's roles in rebellion. And so throughout the revolutionary early republic periods of United States history, enslaved women, men, and children's wartime resistance challenged the creation and development of the new nation. And so scholarship about enslaved people's defiance of state authority during both wars, particularly concerning enslaved women's role in this insurgent activity, still remains one of the least explored areas in slavery studies. Assessing Black women's wartime politics during both wars is a way of building a more robust narrative about the stakes of rebellion and revolution. Most studies about Black wartime experiences center on Black men's military experiences as loyalists and patriots, soldiers and sailors, and how enslaved and free Black men utilize wartime service to free themselves during and in the aftermath of each imperial conflict. Thankfully, Black women's wartime experiences in politics have been centered in recent works by historians Dr. Thavolia Glymph, Dr. Stephanie McCurry, and even more recently in this year, 2021, Dr. Karen Cook Bell, and laid great foundation for my dissertation. In my dissertation, I built on their insights by focusing on how Black women's resistance and leadership during the War of 1812 helped aid the escape attempts of thousands of Chesapeake runaways during the war. I attempt to understand the impact enslaved women made on contributing to Black militancy during this period when the British returned to the Chesapeake, ultimately helped destabilize slavery in the Chesapeake for this small period in the small episode. One of the reasons I chose this episode is because of its similarities also to the American Revolution. For instance, when Virginia's royal governor, Lord Dunmore, declared freedom for runaways bound by patriot enslavers willing to flee to him through the Dunmore's proclamation from November 1775, you see something similar in the War of 1812. because Royal Navy Vice Admiral and later Commander-in-Chief Alexander Cochrane also offered freedom to enslaved people willing to flee. Cochrane's proclamation, signed April 2nd of 1814, stated that, in quote, all those who may be disposed to emigrate from the United States will, with their families, be received on board of His Majesty's ships or vessels of war, end quote. For those that reach British warships, quote, they will have their choice of either entering into His Majesty's or land service forces, or of being sent as free settlers to the British possessions in North America or the West Indies. Another similarity between the proclamations was how enslaved peoples prior rebellionists ultimately cultivated the environment necessary for the creation of both proclamations. Suffice it to say, both proclamations were byproducts of Black resistance, but each, because of the military nature of both, appealed first to Black men because the Royal Navy prioritized male military service roles over the possible wartime roles enslaved women could perform. However, warfare was not and never is the province of men. Black women quickly taught Royal Navy personnel how faulty their gendered logic was regarding Black women's ability to rebel. Because when Royal Navy warships arrived along the Mid-Atlantic shore as early as the spring of 1813, Royal Navy officers quickly learned about enslaved women's powerful ability to both reach their warships and sway other enslaved people to flee to them as well. An example of this fact can be seen through a ship return of Chesapeake runaways fleeing to freedom with the British to Bermuda aboard the Lord Collingwood ship on May 9th of 1814. It shows that out of a total of 150 people, 48 women and 67 children fled, with men accounting for 36 of this group. Which shows that enslaved women's resistance experiences were not at all insignificant. Black women's flight and presence behind British lines was not also, like I said, an isolated phenomenon. In particular, enslaved women and children flooded Royal Navy warships by the hundreds. But when their pursuit of freedom provoked one Royal Navy officer to actually say, quote, out of the number of colored people, a great many are women and children, end quote. And he noted later, there would be no getting the men without receiving them. Although Royal Navy officers cared more about procuring men, like I said, to join their ranks, enslaved women inserted themselves as key decision makers in demonstrating who would ultimately join. Enslaved women saw men's quote-unquote choice joining what became the Colonial Marines as a collective decision, not a personal one. However, Black women's leadership in moments of rebellion and resistance did not always mean taking flight. The best case for this idea occurred in the lives of enslaved men Harry Quay and enslaved brothers General and David Saunders, whose collective freedom hinged on a life-altering conversation on an autumn Sunday evening in 1814 with Quay's unnamed sister. On this unknown evening in early October of 1814, Quay's sister forcefully persuaded Harry, quote, on the subject of going to the British, end quote. She advised him to go, run away from John H.Q. and join his friends, the Saunders brothers, and Ellick, because, quote, the boys were waiting for him, end quote, before they would flee to the British. When her brother left that evening, Quay's sister probably knew that if his escape were successful, their encounter would be the last time she saw her brother, at least in this life. While we might wonder why Quay's sister decided not to abscond with her brother, her decision to stay behind should not be the central focus of this story. Most important for my dissertation is that Quay's sister was a co-conspirator in her brother's act of rebellion. If found out as the primary motivator of Harry's flight, Quay's sister's life could have been in jeopardy. She knew the risks involved with her act of intervention, and yet she ignored the possible consequences. As a result, we must cite Harry's unnamed sister's actions as representative of co-conspiracy because she directly contributed, to her brother and 3 other enslaved men's eventual freedom. Without her, General and David Saunders would not have fled with Harry and Alec in time to thwart any potential recapture attempt from General Saunders' enslaver, Thomas Reynolds. And the Saunders brothers might not have become members of the newly formed all-black colonial Marines and later moved to Trinidad. Quay's sisters' push altered the histories of multiple families and lineages and showed how single moments in history could alter the worlds and geographies of entire family units. Black rebellion occurred in diverse ways, and understanding how enslaved women contributed to rebellion and revolt is essential in any rendering of insurgent struggle. Ultimately, enslaved women like Harry's sister often communicated rebellious and seditious information and should be seen as co-conspirators, militants, and important theorizers of Black freedom as well. As I close out, I must pivot to how we also know about Quay's sister in the first place. Lost to history, at least to us at this moment, is the provenance for how Harry Quay's enslaver learned about Quay's sister's co-conspiracy. Quay's sister's story comes to us via a compensation claim made by his enslaver, John H.Q., from the mid-1820s. After the War of 1812 ultimately ended with the Treaty of Ghent in 1815, the U.S. and Great Britain still had diplomatic issues to parse out. Of most importance, reparation payments to enslavers deprived of their formerly enslaved laborers, like Harry Quay. Diplomatic negotiations between British, U.S., and Russian officials resulted in enslavers obtaining the power to petition the United States for reparations for those that escaped during the war. Enslavers from the Chesapeake states of Maryland, Virginia, and Delaware can claim up to $280 per lost runaway. In a twist of fate, slave resistance became profitable since enslavers can now commodify Black liberation efforts. Quay's sister's insurrectionary language served as an essential piece of the struggle she waged that helped free her brother, his friends, and their family. Quay's sister engaged in an important political struggle for survival that did not center her own attainment of freedom, and ultimately her brothers and her friends. Like I previously mentioned, Quay's sister knew the potential consequences of her actions. We do not know why she ultimately did not leave with her brother, or even if she ever attempted to. Or maybe in a way more important, how Quay came across this information and what he did when he found out. Was Quay's sister flogged, sold in the growing domestic slave trade that sent tens of thousands of enslaved people to the Deep South's cotton plantations? Or was she even later killed because of it? Co-conspiracy often led to these brutal consequences, as we'll obviously find out with Dr. Thomas's work. But they also represent that no matter what happened to Harry Quay's unnamed sister, we must always center the politics and decision-making of enslaved women, men, and children, often not talked about in these moments. Harry and the Saunders brothers' war led them to freedom within the broader British Empire, but the person whose actions opened the door to reach said freedom remained nameless and likely unfree. Despite scholars not knowing what became of Quay's sister, my choice is to center her leadership in helping guide, even through words, these men and their families to freedom, and show why we should center enslaved women's politics and our struggles to overhaul this brutal and white supremacist social order. Thank you.
Thank you, Adam.
Thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Adam. And now we'll turn it over to Adam Thomas.
Yeah, hi everyone. Thanks, Adam, for a really fascinating paper, and to all my fellow panelists for being part of this. I'm really excited to be on a panel with scholars whose work I so admire. And thank you to everyone for coming as well, especially so early in the morning and not in New Orleans. I should also say my book is not under contract with UNC Press. I very much want it to be, and I hope it will be in time. But I should say that as of right now, it isn't. And I don't want any UNC Press editors who might be listening to think it should be. But just to clarify that. For my paper, I'm going to read, just for the sake, it's the only way I can keep time, so apologies for that. But I will bring up some slides right now, which will be a little bit more interesting than just me reading. So can everyone see my slides now? Hopefully. All right. So yeah. Beginning in the early hours of August 22nd, 1831, a small group of enslaved and free black people, around 60 at their height, traveled between local farms in Southampton County, Virginia, recruiting as they went and killing every white person from a slaveholding family they encountered. Within 2 days, militia converged on the area, inflicting brutal violence to halt the rebels' march. The freedom fighters killed 55 whites. Counter-revolutionary forces killed an unknown number of black people in response. Several suspected rebels stood trial. Courts discharged 24, exiled 12, and hanged 19. The Virginia legislature debated manumission after the uprising, but instead imposed further restrictions on the enslaved. Historians typically render the Southampton County Emancipation War, better known as the Nat Turner Revolt for its purported leader, as a near-exclusively male affair. Beyond Vanessa Holden's exceptional recent scholarship, which Adam mentioned, narratives cast women as an insidious sisterhood opposing the rebellion, or more often, as minor players with little influence over its course. By analyzing material culture associated with one enslaved woman, Lucy, I suggest she played a more nuanced and important role than has been acknowledged. So Lucy, described as about 20 years old, was the only woman to stand trial as a rebel, and the trial transcript provides significant detail about her actions during the uprising. First to testify against Lucy was her only surviving enslaver, Mary Barrow. Barrow's husband, John, died in the uprising. Mary recalled that as she sought to hide from the advancing rebels, Lucy seized and held her about 1 minute until another enslaved person escorted Mary to safety. Lucy's purpose, Mary assumed, was to detain her until freedom fighters arrived, and had they found Barrow, they would almost certainly have killed her. And so if the trial ended here, Barrow's statement would likely have offered enough evidence for a conviction. But she conceded she did not know certainly what Lucy's intentions were. And up on the screen now, hopefully you can see Mary Barrow's testimony, or excerpts of Mary Barrow's testimony. So she did not know certainly what Lucy's intentions were in accosting her. And with Southampton slaveholding elites eager to prove the efficacy of their institutions in response to calls for abolition, the court called more witnesses to strengthen the case. An enslaved man, Bird, testified that after the uprising, he found 4 pieces of money in a bag of feathers and covered with a handkerchief in the room Lucy shared with Moses, a man already executed for his part in the rebellion. And this relationship and possession of the money, combined with the apparent attack on Mary Barrow, affirmed Lucy's guilt in the eyes of the court, and on the 26th of September, she was hanged. Analysis of Lucy's trial tends to focus on the coins. As something that few enslaved people had, money constituted, in the words of one historian, compelling physical evidence. In this interpretation, Lucy capitalized on the chaos of the uprising to steal from the Barrows. Less consideration has been afforded the bag of feathers. Lucy's decision to hide the money could reflect its value or its contraband nature, but would feathers have held similar meanings? Why would Lucy conceal seemingly commonplace items alongside prized possessions? If we place the uprising in a transatlantic context, a possible answer emerges. As commonly available items that could serve as conduits of supernatural power, feathers and bags of feathers were a staple of West African-derived religions practiced by enslaved people throughout the Americas. Enslaved people placed various items, depending on availability and the creator's specific goal, in these conjure bags. And they were often made from red flannel, tied with string, containing natural items and grave dirt to channel the influence of ancestors. The natural item could be something seemingly mundane, like feathers, which the conjurer rendered sacred through the ritual of the bag's creation. And in this way, the conjurer called forth and enclosed within the bags power from the spirit world, and this could then be directed outward for a specific purpose. To increase its accuracy, a bag might include an item belonging to its target. Enslaved people used these bags and feathers within them throughout the Americas. Despite British colonial authorities criminalizing possession of feathers as evidence of obeah rituals in Jamaica in 1760, enslaved and freed people continued to use them for that purpose 80 years later. At least 80 years later, I'm sure after that too. In Martinique and Guadeloupe, Quimbois rituals used small cloth bags full of grain and feathers for protection. And enslaved people crafted bags of feathers in hoodoo traditions in antebellum South Carolina. Govan Littlejohn believed a rival injured him by leaving beneath his doorstep some pins, feathers, and something else all tied up in a bag. As Taya Miles notes in her study of material culture and slavery, conjure bags populated enslaved people's daily lives across the US South, the Caribbean islands, and Latin America, and they assumed various guises and names known variously as gree-gree bags, hands, or mojos. Beyond South Carolina, people once enslaved in Alabama, Louisiana, and Texas recalled the use of these bags, showing how widely they spread throughout the US. And Virginia was no exception. Mirinda Jane Singleton witnessed conjure in Norfolk, tracing its origins to enslaved Africans brought to the Commonwealth via the Caribbean. She recalled that scraps of cloth with certain foul feathers were believed to work charms or spells on the person desired. And it's not hard to imagine that their use also extended to Southampton County, just 50 miles from where Singleton was enslaved. Viewed in this light, Lucy's bag of feathers begins to appear more than the sum of parts listed in a trial transcript. When we consider also that conjure practitioners frequently use silver coins to detect the presence of hoodoo work inflicted by others, the items Bird found in Lucy's room begin to look less like evidence of theft and more like the contents of a hidey hole. As Charlotte notes, archaeological investigation of these secret spaces and slave quarters provide rich material evidence of the sacred practices of enslaved communities, including items for conjuration. Southampton's pro-slavery legal authorities did not realize in rushing to judgment, but Bird's account seemingly offered such evidence of these practices. If Lucy's feathers were part of a conjure bag, she may have constructed it for use in the rebellion, extending a long history of spiritual work in anti-slavery warfare. Conjurers influenced uprisings and conspiracies throughout North America, from New York in 1712 and 1741 to South Carolina in 1822 and Virginia in 1800 and 1812. A Virginian conjurer had even attempted to organize enslaved people's insurrectionary support for Britain during the Revolutionary War. Thus, if Lucy was also a practitioner, she built on Black radical traditions, both transnational and local. Conjure bags could constitute weapons, as the aforementioned case of Govan Littlejohn makes clear. Lucy may have concocted one to bring misfortune upon her enslavers. Mirinda Singleton's account of bags containing feathers in Norfolk mirrored Littlejohn's experience in South Carolina. She recalled items of spiritual power placed where the victim would walk over them before becoming deathly ill and perhaps dying of the spell if it were not removed. Virginia Hay Shepherd, enslaved in nearby Portsmouth, noted similar practices. If Lucy made the bag for such violent ends, it would offer another potential explanation for the presence of the money. If the coins did come from the Barrows, placing personal belongings in a conjure bag would have helped Lucy focus its influence upon them. Although something from the body of a charm's intended target, like hair, would have worked better, money carried particular symbolic meaning. Having long witnessed enslavers amass wealth by exploiting, selling, hiring out, and inheriting her kin in Southampton County, Lucy would have recognized money as something deeply personal to the Barrows. Having been transferred as property herself at least twice by the time of the uprising, once as an inheritance and once as a dowry, she knew how slaveholders coveted money. Knowing the Barrows invested coins with their own spiritual power, what delicious irony it would have been to then turn that power against them. If this was Lucy's intention, she aligned herself with rebels who, by destroying generations of white families, broke chains of inheritance that bound them and their descendants endlessly to slaveholders. Like these more recognized freedom fighters, Lucy's actions could have signaled condemnation of slavery's immoral economy. If we read the objects found in Lucy's room as evidence of conjuration, how should we reinterpret her role in the rebellion? Perhaps she stood alongside Nat Turner as a chief source of its ideology. There was precedent for conjure women taking such leading roles in uprisings. Nanny, leader of the Windward Maroons in Jamaica, is one example. Knowledge of Obeah constituted a key part of what Cedric Robinson called Nanny's ethos of the Black radical tradition, and that ethos motivated her community's war against Britain in the 1730s. It is equally possible that Lucy used knowledge of conjuration to help her kin and community survive the ordeal of the uprising. Conjuration could be a source of healing or defense as well as attack, with practitioners wielding spiritual power to locate a potential source of misfortune and control it. Knowing that the rebellion and white retaliation was imminent, Lucy may have composed the bag to secure supernatural protection for her, Moses, or members of the wider community. Perhaps she participated in what Lewis Hughes, also enslaved in Virginia, called the custom of carrying voodoo bags. Just as Hughes's community believed such an item would prevent anyone who carried it from being whipped, perhaps Lucy thought her bag would protect her from the violence of the uprising. Or perhaps she made the objects to help others shield themselves from danger. Enslaved people would pay for such security, offering another explanation for the coins. Lorenza Ezel, enslaved in South Carolina, recalled how a conjure doctor could make plenty of money in this way. If Lucy performed any of these various spiritual works, she reinforces Vanessa Holden's analysis of the rebellion as the product of an interconnected community in which women's labor was essential. Lucy may have shared Turner's role as author of the ideology which motivated all freedom fighters, but we do not need to position her as a leader to recognize her significance. If instead she offered protection from harm to a small subset of her kin, her case offers a nuanced picture of the uprising in line with Holden's view. In this reading, social authority and skill were distributed diffusely throughout the community, extending far beyond a small group of soldiers. Enslaved people occupied a more varied set of roles that were crucial not just to men's ability to wage war, but to the larger community's ability to survive it. By 1831, slaveholders identified conjuration closely with slave resistance. Mirinda Singleton recalled how in consequence they inflicted severe punishments to those that took part in any way. But why then did Southampton slaveholding authorities not recognize Lucy as a conjurer? Perhaps because of the steps enslaved people took to conceal the operation of spiritual power. Nat Turner denied outright that his influence owed anything to conjuring and such like tricks, of which he always spoke with contempt. While this contempt seems to evince Turner's devout Christianity, it might instead signal an attempt to obscure use of conjuration by Southampton's enslaved people and thereby save them from punishment. This would fit a larger pattern of enslaved witnesses imposing silences in trial records to protect kin. Turner, for example, never mentioned his wife Cherry. While Lucy's fate had already been sealed when Turner disavowed conjuration, perhaps he hoped to prevent others who sought Lucy's spiritual protection from sharing her end. And Lucy also stayed silent. When given the chance to defend her actions, she told the court nothing. Knowing that she could not save herself, perhaps she extended her protection to her community one last time. This silence proved especially effective because it served the aims of Virginia's slaveholding elites and therefore confirmed their bias. As the state legislature debated abolition in the aftermath of the uprising, enslavers sought to downplay the dangers of rebellion. To reassure an anxious white public that existing institutions could control the enslaved, they depicted the uprising as an aberration, the exceptional result of a lone deluded fanatic in Turner. And this framing relied on the fiction that no widespread opposition to slavery existed among the enslaved. Desperate to deny the existence of a broad resistive culture, enslavers at local and state levels refused to closely interrogate evidence of that culture. If the objects Bird described to the court did constitute a conjure bag, investigators had a vested interest in not seeing what was right in front of them. Had slaveholders seen something to gain from a fuller accounting of the uprising, Lucy would probably still have escaped further attention. Prosecutors also did not recognize conjuration because they could not countenance enslaved women as political actors. Mary Barrow's uncertainty about Lucy's motive indicates how unthinkable Lucy's active involvement initially was. Because military and legal authorities assumed men were more capable of rebellion, and because male witnesses sought to protect women from recriminations, male defendants too, I should say, women often escaped the attention of legal institutions. The accepted wisdom until recently that the uprising was the work almost entirely of men developed from these gaps in the archive. As a result, records produced by these institutions obscure the key roles women did play. While there is comfort in knowing, as Dr. Holden has said, that silence allowed survival, there remain ways to address, speculatively at least, the work women did in the shadows cast by the narrow spotlight authorities shone on Turner and his male compatriots. Material culture analysis offers one method. Attention to the objects women used and the meanings those objects held within specific historical contexts allows us to reinterpret the lives of women like Lucy. A close reading of 4 Pieces of Money in
I'm afraid looks like we have a technical problem. Can you hear Adam? Adam?
Yep, I can hear.
You can hear him?
Oh, no, I can't hear him. I can hear you.
Okay, so his audio has gone off. Is that correct? Yes.
Yeah, I can't.
Okay.
Yeah, and Dr. Carter Jackson's shaking her head too.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, everybody. I'm sorry about that. We have some problem here. I presume Thomas is trying to correct his tech. We'll give him 1 minute. If he doesn't come back, we will move on to Professor Carter Jackson's paper. Because I had the pleasure of reading these in advance, I know he was very close to the end. And when he gets back with us, I'm sure he'll be happy to share the conclusion. So let's give it 1 minute. And if he doesn't come back, Kellie, will you be ready to go? Let's give it a second. Okay, Kellie, why don't you start, and Adam, I'll send Adam a message and you continue with your entire paper. And when Adam gets back on, we'll let him say his last few words to wrap up his thing. Thanks so much, everybody.
Okay. Yes, this given it in the 21st century, these tech difficulties are just some things that happen. But it's good that we can pivot back when he joins us again. So first, I just want to say thank you so much for being on this, allowing me to be on this panel. I consider it a pleasure, absolutely, but also a privilege just to be in conversation with established scholars, but also up-and-coming scholars. I'm really excited for the work that both Adams are doing. And so it's just really good to be here. I want to also say that I have tried to take like a big paper and like give you like an abbreviated, truncated version of some of the greatest hits of Black women abolitionists and what they're doing in this moment as it relates to violence. So I'm going to share my screen with you and get started. I'll be reading the bulk of this paper, but I will try to pop in and out with additional comments. Okay. Okay. Can you all see my screen? Hold on. Okay. I can't see any of y'all, so if someone just pops on and says
yes.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay, good. Okay, good. All right. Let me get started. Okay. The story of Massachusetts Senator and abolitionist Charles Sumner and his brutal beating by Preston Brooks is familiar in antebellum history. In the spring of 1856, Sumner gave a controversial 3-hour speech about the Kansas-Nebraska Act. 2 days later, on May 22nd, Sumner was sitting in his Senate chamber when Brooks entered his office and stated, quote, "I have read your speech twice over carefully. It is libel on South Carolina and Mr. Butler, who's a relative of mine." At that moment, he began to strike Sumner over the head using a thick gutta-percha cane with a gold head. Sumner was repeatedly bludgeoned over his entire body. He tried to crawl under his desk for refuge, but given that his desk was bolted to the floor, it only served as a holding pin while Brooks continued to take aim at him. Brooks beat him so relentlessly that the desk eventually released from the floor. As Sumner lay bloodied and unconscious, Brooks stopped only when his cane broke. The caning sparked national outrage, and one of the most remarkable responses to Sumner's beating came from an editorial in the New Orleans Daily Creole, a Black newspaper that had debuted about a month after the attack. The op-ed was titled "A Challenge to Mr. Brooks." Mrs. Amelia R.M. Robinson called the attacks cowardly to beat a man unarmed and down. She referred to Mr. Brooks as a cringing puppy who she would gladly challenge to meet her in any place with pistols, rifles, or cowhides. The outrage Robinson felt had no bearing on her sex. She, like many other Black male leaders, was exasperated by the sacrifices that had cost her dearly. She was 50 years old and a widow. She lost 2 of her sons in the Mexican War. Brooks' actions represented a direct affront to her own liberty, a liberty that she believed her country should protect. Now then, Mr. Brooks, Mrs. Robinson challenged, let us see some of your boasted courage. You are afraid to meet a man. Dare you meet a woman? Robinson declared that she was anxious to do her country some service, either by whipping or choking the cowardly ruffian, who threatened what she perceived as America's most precious right, freedom of speech. Robinson was willing to put her strong words into print to expose her disdain regarding the attack of Sumner. And more than any man, she was willing to publicly retaliate. While many were praying for Sumner, Robinson illustrates what she was willing to do with the pistol. And I think this is so interesting too, because, she puts her full name in there. She doesn't operate under a pseudonym. She's bold with this public statement that is being published in the newspaper. Much is revealed by Robinson's remarks. She was publicly challenging Senator Brooks and taunting him even. She wrote with a rage that signaled she had nothing to lose. The fact that Sumner was immobilized for most of the beating under his desk was perhaps the greatest act of cowardice on the part of Brooks. Not only was Robinson ready to meet Brooks weapon for weapon with pistols, rifles, or cowhides, but she proclaimed that she would even whip him without weapons by choking the cowardly ruffian. Robinson was 50 and fearless. Few men, white or black, responded with threats to meet Sumner's violence with violence. Robinson was willing to not just take on any man, but a public figure and a politician. And while Northern sentiment abhorred what they regarded as Southern barbarism, Robinson was undeterred. The significance of her being a Black woman threatening violence against a white man should also be duly noted. The sexual violence that white men committed against Black women was rampant. Sumner was not wrong to allude to sexual imagery in his speech. It is likely that Robinson's rage also stemmed from the gendered violence that enslaved women faced daily. Rape, violence, and the theft of children left enslaved women with no recourse. Nearly 6 months prior, a prominent legal case, the state of Missouri versus Celia, claimed Black women were deemed unrapeable and prohibited from defending themselves. And the story of Celia it's a really prominent story that many people know. So I won't be able to go into too many details, but hopefully in the Q&A we can talk more about some of these women and their lived experiences. Accordingly, her response was clear. Meet violence with violence, or more specifically, meet their cowardly acts with justice. And I just want to give a shout out to Nikki Taylor at Howard University right now, who's writing a phenomenal book about Black women and their violence and their rage, their deadly or lethal violence. And I'm excited for new work that's coming out that will talk about this in new and especially nuanced ways. So in slavery or on the one, in freedom and during the war, Black women played pivotal roles in shaping our understanding of the trauma of slavery and the terrorism it causes. Often we see enslaved women or fugitives risking everything to give themselves and their families better lives. Scholars have little discussed, however, free Black women who employed force and violence and risked their very freedom, if not their lives, to ensure the freedom of others. How Black women abolitionists utilized violence deserves a more sustained analysis. Black women's resistance was central to abolitionism, and Black women were essential to the movement. And I'm using this picture only because it just shows a group of Black women that just look so fierce to me. I had to include it as an optic. This essay will argue that their activism should be examined as the politics of protective violence. The politics of protective violence explains Black women's employment of force to protect themselves and their communities and ultimately promote the overthrow of slavery. While self-defense implies an individual act to protect oneself, protective violence seeks to protect all vulnerable people and even entire communities. However, the resistance is politically specific. Slave owners, slave catchers, snitches, anyone who interfered with the pursuit of freedom was at risk for facing Black women's armed position. Black women have never been afraid to use violent force to protect themselves and their loved ones. Violent resistance did not belong to men alone, nor was the use of force reserved to enslaved women only. Though within the historiography, Black women are centralized primarily as victims of violence or ignored and pushed to the margins of violence resistance as helpers. Black women have fallen into blind groups where their involvement at best is vague. Phrases such as Black residents, colored crowds, armed farmers, or even a Negro mob prevent us from seeing gender. The assumption is that the mob is male, or that the resisting group is completely made up of men. And I think this is a really good quote by Frederick Douglass, where he just talks about the centrality of Black women within the abolitionist movement. And he says, when the true history of the anti-slavery cause shall be written, women will occupy a large space in its pages. For the cause of slavery has been peculiarly a woman's cause. And leave it to Douglass to always have a quote for everything. But I think it's just a perfect way to encapsulate how really Black women in particular, he says women, I'm going to say Black women, are really at the heart and center of so much of the movement. Protective violence is not only about the harm it causes those in opposition, but also how it undermines the institution of slavery. The role of Black women leaders in engaging violent resistance varied. The politics of protective violence served as an umbrella in which force was employed in writings, speeches, threats, financial support or withdrawal, sheltering fugitive slaves, or in extreme cases, murder. Each prong was a viable canopy for protecting and advocating for the enslaved, as well as undermining or dismantling the institution of slavery. These groups of women, these groups were run as, and when I say groups, I mean like vigilant groups, were run as a labor of love. The lack of sufficient finances was a constant impediment, and all their efforts placed them at significant risk, particularly after the Fugitive Slave Law. But many Black women in the North had the mobility as domestic workers to serve as the eyes and ears of vigilance committees. During their daily chores, Black women could overhear conversations and keep note of suspicious Southern visitors. Black women bore the burden of some of the most daring tasks, caring for and hiding fugitive slaves. And I want to start to tell some of their stories more specifically. So during the 1850s, there are countless stories of Black women and their allies employing the use of axes and pistols and rifles and like that to combat slave catchers in the region. Records of the radical and heroic stories of fugitive slaves who successfully resisted the return of slavery could not be circulated fast enough. William Still, known as the father of the Underground Railroad and responsible for the successful escape of over 800 slaves, made a point of recording his encounters with runaways. In his large collection of narratives and interviews, the following is one of the many accounts that stand out of 4 runaway slaves. Mary Elizabeth Grigsby and her husband Barnaby Grigsby, along with Emily Foster and her fiance Frank Rasner, escaped from Loudoun County, Virginia. Mary Elizabeth and Emily Foster were sisters. Neither couple could enjoy the protections of marriage. Their masters had all had reputations for violence and a proclivity for separating families at the auction block. Emily was owned by Townsend McVee. It was well known that his wife knew, quote, knew no mercy nor showed any favor, end quote. Frank Rasner claimed that his owner, Luther Sullivan, was the meanest man in Virginia. The couples left on Christmas Eve of 1855. They journeyed over 100 miles on horseback in a carriage stolen from their master. With Frank Rasner leading them, the group suffered from hunger, freezing temperatures, and exhaustion as they traveled to their eventual destination of Canada. When they made it as far as Cheat River, Maryland, quote, 6 white men and a boy who suspected they were fugitives confronted them. They planned to attack the group and return them to their rightful owners. When asked to account for themselves, Rasner declared that he was riding along civilly and there was no cause for interruption. But the white men were convinced that the group was composed of fugitives and refused to leave until they surrendered. Feeling cornered and without alternatives, the runaways pulled out their concealed pistols and dirks. Both women and men declared they would not be taken. One white man raised his gun and pointed it directly at one of the women, threatening to shoot her, perhaps thinking she would surrender out of fear. It is not clear whether he pointed the gun at Mary Elizabeth or Emily Foster, but with a double-barreled pistol in one hand and a long, dark dirk knife in the other, one sister shouted back, "Shoot, shoot, shoot. Undeterred, she egged him on. Her call to shoot could be interpreted in a couple of ways. First, she could have been calling on her comrades to point their guns at the opposing group of men. She was leading the fugitives to act with the weapons they possessed. Or second, she could have been daring the opposing men to shoot at them, knowing that dead fugitives could not retrieve any reward. All enslaved people had economic value that was useless if runaways were not captured alive. Knowing this, in William Still's account, he affirmed that the woman was, quote, utterly unterrified and fully ready for a death struggle, end quote. Once again, Black women could not play the role of the damsel in distress because slavery neither afforded them the luxury of being seen as damsels nor considered their duress. Black women were refused the protections of femininity afforded to white women. In the face of such unflinching determination to spill blood, kill, or die, the group of men left the travelers to continue on their way. It appeared that the slave catchers were only keen to return slaves so long as their own lives were not at risk. Returning unarmed or outnumbered Black men and women was easy. Confronting armed Black women and men with nothing to lose was an act of foolishness. And an image, and this is the image that I'm showing in Still's collection of fugitive narratives, the powerful optic is titled A Bold Stroke for Freedom. This image is an unflinching portrait of slave resistance. Centered prominently is the likeness of Mary Elizabeth or Emily Foster, armed with both a pistol and a dirk knife. And you can see, I don't know if I have it, there's the pistol, there's the dirk knife. She stands, feet planted, utterly unterrified by the gun held in front of her. What is also interesting about the image is how both white men featured in the illustration appear to be looking directly at the Black woman. It is her taunts and threats that provoke them to turn on their heels and retreat. The image is both forceful and feminist. She is the center of the sketch. She is defending her body, her sister, and the men. By placing herself on the line for everyone in the group, she does not wait for men to defend her. As a Black woman, she is keenly aware that she is not only susceptible to physical harm, but sexual assault. Accordingly, she is more armed than anyone else in the image. Protective violence belonged to everyone in the group, but this Black woman verbalized her personal and political intent the clearest. The Frederick Examiner, a local newspaper in Maryland, received word of the event that had taken place. And rather than report the true facts of the story, it informed readers that most of the group succeeded in escaping while one Black man was shot in the back as he tried to flee on a horse. Still surmised that the reporter misinformed his readers because they did not wish to reveal that fugitives, and in particular Black women, were willing to take up violence. Nor did they wish to undermine the prevailing myth of the docile, loyal slave. Eventually, the four made their way to Syracuse, where they met up with the Vigilance Committee, headed by Jermaine Logan, a Black abolitionist and community leader. After they celebrated their freedom with newfound friends, they proceeded to Toronto, where they were, quote, gladly received by the ladies of society for aiding colored refugees. Women helped to create and cultivate on-the-ground success in the abolitionist movement. The care and safe spaces they operated and protected were essential to fugitive slaves that were in desperate need to begin new lives. And I want to tell like one more story. I think I have enough time, but feel free to cut me off if I'm going too long. I will wrap up. I want to tell one more story about Margaret Garner and then a little bit on Harriet Tubman. So dare you meet Margaret Garner. In January of 1856, 22-year-old Margaret Garner escaped slavery with 7 members of her family. They fled the Maplewood plantation in Boone County, Kentucky, during one of the coldest winters on record. They walked across a frozen Ohio River and into a free state of Ohio, where they found refuge in the home of Margaret's uncle, Joe Kite. After enjoying freedom for mere hours, slave catchers and U.S. Marshals found the fugitives and attempted to break down the door to the home where they were hiding. In a moment of chaos and panic, Margaret slit her 2-year-old daughter's throat and attempted to kill her other 3 children to prevent them from being taken back into slavery. Before she could, she was arrested. And during her trial, she declared, "I did the best a mother could do, and I would have done better and more for the rest. I've done the best I could." If given the chance, she would have killed all of her children to prevent them from returning to the hell of slavery. For Garner, if freedom could not be had, then death was the only other form of deliverance. And she and her remaining family were eventually returned to slavery. But Margaret was not sent back to her master's plantation. Her family was sent apart, and she, along with her husband, were sent to the Deep South. Garner made national headlines when she killed her child to prevent a return to slavery. She, too, illustrated what desperate lengths Black women were willing to go to obtain liberty in the face of death. It was perhaps the ultimate expression of protective violence. Black women were giving Garner's story a platform to dispel the myth of a happy and contented slave. For example, expatriate Mary Ann Shadd Cary was the leading Black woman in the abolitionist movement in Canada. She founded and ran the Provincial Freeman. And when Shadd Cary learned about Garner and her slain child, her newspaper spoke in admiring tones of her bold and desperate act. She even suggested that Garner's spirit should be cultivated. Not only did the Provincial Freedmen support Garner's sentiments and actions, but it also added that all endeavors should be made to, quote, cut the throats of the lawless pursuers, which would have been in compliance with the scriptures. The Provincial Freedmen published James Madison Bell's poem, Liberty or Death, in which he declared, long live the name of Margaret Garner in every freedman's breast. And then lastly, I would just be remiss if I didn't touch on Harriet Tubman when it comes to thinking about protective violence. Many of us are familiar, obviously, with Harriet Tubman and all of her dozens of rescues of men, women, and children. But what I love about her is that she was known to have kept a pistol on her at all times and would not have hesitated to use it. Tubman would threaten to shoot not only any pursuing person or dog, but also any enslaved runaway who contemplated returning to the plantation to potentially soil her rescue efforts. Story after story, witness testified to Tubman's belief in the utility of protective violence. During one rescue, a man protested that among the fleeing group that he was going to return to the plantation when success for their escape looked bleak. Tubman turned her gun on the man's head and said, "You go on or die." Given these options, the man endured, and just several days later, the group arrived in Canada. Protective violence also included preventing sabotage. Thus, Tubman's politics put the group above the individual. And as I want to close here, just thinking about the long trajectory of Black women activists, including people like Ida B. Wells, who declared a Winchester rifle should have a place of honor in every Black home, and it should be used for the protection which the law refuses to give. Also, Fannie Lou Hamer, who once exclaimed, "I keep a shotgun in every corner of my bedroom. The first cracker even looked like he wanted to throw some dynamite on my porch. Won't write his mama again." And even Rosa Parks, who believed in self-defense. Her beloved grandfather always kept a shotgun within reach, and her husband, Raymond Parks, was also an activist. At meetings he conducted, Rosa recalled the kitchen table was covered with guns. Rosa Parks also declared that Malcolm X was her personal hero. So I want to end with this quote, which I think pushes back on a lot of the ideas that we have about women, especially when we look in a 20th century moment about like nonviolence and the civil rights movement. And this is from Cynthia Washington. She says, "I was never a true believer in nonviolence, but I was willing to go along with it for the sake of strategy and goals." She exclaimed that the deaths of the three civil rights workers, James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schorner, were a turning point for her, especially when she heard that Chaney had been brutally beaten before he was shot to death. Washington acknowledged that, quote, "the thought of being beat to death without being able to fight back put the fear of God in me." She also explained that she was her mother's only child, and that while it would have been an unforgivable sin to be endangered by white supremacists and go down without a fight. And from then on, Washington carried a handgun, and she admitted, quote, "I acquired an automatic handgun to sit in the top of that outstanding black patent and tan handbag that I carried. And even though I never fired it, I made it clear what I was willing to do." And I think this is really interesting because not only is she talking about possessing an armed weapon or a pistol, but she also talks about it in tandem with her, cute patent leather handbag. And I just think that, again, we can't really separate like femininity from how women are thinking about force and how women are thinking about violence. So I want to thank you for allowing me to give this talk today. And I want us to just be reminded that all throughout history, throughout the 19th century and the 20th century, Black women have never been afraid to use force and never been afraid to use violence and never been afraid to protest, not just for the rights of themselves, but for the rights of all people. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So Adam, we're sorry about your tech problem.
I'm sorry.
Would you like a few minutes to give us the conclusion to your paper? I believe you were pretty close to the end when you lost your audio.
Sure. How can you remember the last thing that I was saying? Because I have no idea where I dropped off.
I couldn't pinpoint that. I think maybe you should just give us the conclusion. We heard enough to get the main points, and then we'll have my comments, which will remind people and bring the papers back together, and we'll save some time then for the Q&A. Sure.
Okay, so yeah, I'd mentioned the kind of possibilities of Lucy as a conjurer, and then kind of talked very briefly about how one of the reasons we might not have recognized this before is of silences in the archive. And so I'll just kind of read my last paragraph, which was kind of following from the silences in the archive that were imposed by enslaved people and also slaveholders. And so as a result, records produced by these institutions, pro-slavery institutions, obscure the key roles women did play. While there is comfort in knowing that science allowed survival, as Dr. Holden has pointed out, there remain ways to address, speculatively at least, the work that women did in the shadows cast by the narrow spotlight authority shone on Turner and his male compatriots. Material culture analysis offers one method: attention to the objects women used and the meaning those objects held within specific historical contexts allows us to reinterpret the lives of women like Lucy. A close reading of 4 pieces of money in a bag of feathers can move her from margins to center, turning a thief into a freedom fighter, healer, protector, or conjurer. And perhaps it might do the same for other women documented in the archives of resistance. So yeah, sorry about that. Like, there's a lot to recommend Southern Appalachia, but internet connection is not one of them. So yeah, apologies for where we ended up. But
well,
thank you for sticking with it.
And thank you, Adam, for getting back on and working that out and not panicking. Okay, everybody. So put your questions in the chat. I'm just going to take a few minutes to reflect on these 3 outstanding papers on the theme of Black women's role in anti-slavery warfare. As you have just heard, these papers and this panel were expertly put together. They cover a temporal span from the early Republic to the Civil War, and with Dr. Carter Jackson's conclusion, reach into the last third of the 20th century. So there's certainly no complaints there. These scholars' work on Black women in war is obviously buttressed by a slew of recent publications, especially recently on the American Civil War, that challenge assumptions about what spaces and actions constitute a state of war and who we understand as actors in war. But as you can see, their papers also draw on a deep well of work on slave resistance and anti-slavery organization and action in the United States and the Caribbean. So it's fair to say that notwithstanding a century at least of outstanding Black history and at least 40 years of feminist scholarship, I think it's fair to say, we have to admit, that the gendered and racial structures and hierarchies of our discipline remain intact, including in 19th century Southern history. It's a shocker, I know. And thus the assault on the ramparts continues and has to continue as here today. So Adam McNeil's paper focuses our attention on the Chesapeake Bay and the War of 1812, and on the evidence of a pattern now familiar to us of enslaved Black people, women prominent among them, seizing the opportunities of war to force change, including in military policy. His case of going to the British, so to speak, is far less known to us than the Revolutionary War one of Dunmore's famous proclamation, which makes it onto every syllabus in Southern and African American history and histories of the Revolution and of the founding and so forth. Adam McNeil's paper focuses on enslaved women's role as key decision makers, as he puts it, and he trains his eye fruitfully on one woman he identifies as, quote, a co-conspirator in her brother's act of rebellion. Her brother's act of rebellion was flight and military service for the British and the Black colonial Marines in the Caribbean. McNeil's paper gives us a vivid glimpse of the familial networks out of which anti-slavery radicalism, activism, and militance arise. And I think this is a crucial point for women. I'm sorry, I should say for men as for women, those cultural traditions and patterns arise out of kinship and familial ones, not just for women. And he's also focusing our eye on women's centrality to these patterns of militant resistance. His further claim that Quay's sister was a theorizer of freedom remains a little bit underdeveloped, and I invite him to speak to that in the Q&A. McNeil's analysis engages with the question of evidence and its limits. He tells us that he learned of her role in a compensation claim, and he talks about the limits of that source. There's a lot he cannot know and cannot tell us about the woman herself, including her name and the consequences possibly fatal for her life in this act of resistance. Thinking about Adam's paper, I would say I'm deeply sympathetic to this problem of the limits of evidence, but especially because of that, it would have been helpful if he had sketched out the universe of sources available to him in writing this history, the dissertation project more broadly defined, both to establish the context of the one story he tells us and to let the audience in on the methodological challenges of interpretation presented by the source base that he does have. So that's the one suggestion that I would make for a different and fuller version of the paper. Adam Thomas's paper focuses our attention on what he calls the Southampton County Emancipation War. The setting is Virginia, 1831, Nat Turner's Revolt, as us old people learned it, and on the value of material culture evidence in uncovering enslaved women's role in wars of resistance to slavery, such as this one. Like all good papers, it gives us a concrete return in reference to the specific event and a methodological return that's portable and of use in research and analysis of other similar events. He is able to do that because of the wide base of reading he has, not just in US, but Caribbean history. And here I would just want to make the broader point that we all have to be very aware of the limits of our Americanist training in the United States and read widely outside US history. The material culture object at issue in Adam's paper is a bag of coins and feathers belonging to a woman called Lucy, the only enslaved woman to stand trial as a rebel in that revolt, and she was executed for her role in it. Thomas's reading is expert and subtle. He sees it as evidence, the material object, as evidence of a conjure bag that served as a conduit of supernatural power. And this is a point, like all good ones, that become obvious once they're stated. He tells us, we know conjurers influenced uprisings throughout the history of North America. If Lucy was a practitioner of African-derived religions, he says, she built on Black radical traditions, both transnational and local. And that seems very obvious once it's stated, but it isn't in advance. Thomas's paper shows the value of speculation, but of careful, informed speculation. Perhaps, he says, it was a conjure bag. Perhaps she made the object as a defensive tactic to provide protection from harm to her kin. And that, he goes on to say, if it was true, would shift the interpretation to a different aspect of the anti-slavery war, survival. And I found this a really valuable point. It's an important contribution. Thomas's analysis is rich because of the ingenious use of sources, primary and secondary sources, buttressing what he knows about his particular case and this particular object with wide reading about such events in other places. The lacuna in the sources that he identifies and historians' uncritical reliance on sources, these kinds of sources, is one reason so many historians still find women's resistance literally unthinkable. You have to think critically about the sources to start with to know what you can get out of them, and more importantly, what you cannot. I would argue, and I have argued, that the same is true about Union military records in the Civil War, and even sometimes of the Freedmen's Bureau records, that just absolute rich trove, but which carries its own obvious interests and blind spots. Turning that conjure bag around in front of us like a jewel, Thomas shows us how seeing it might, quote, turn a thief like Lucy into a freedom fighter, a healer, a protector, or a conjurer, vastly expanding our understanding of the role of women in rebellion and resistance. Kellie Carter Jackson's paper gives us a glimpse of the argument she makes in her 2019 book, Force and Freedom, Black Abolitionists and the Politics of Violence, and her 2020 article, Dare You Meet a Woman? She shifts the focus to the late 1850s and sometimes, but not always, to free Black women and their readiness to exercise violent resistance, to spill blood, kill or die, as she eloquently puts it, to ensure their own freedom and to secure it for others. She calls this protective violence, and she defines it as a kind of umbrella for all kinds of force, a spectrum of sorts that stretches from writing acts, speech acts, financial support, physical support, armed self-defense, and at the extreme, infanticide and murder. The role of women, she says, is often obscured by the gender-blind categorization of groups that historians use when they read these sources, like a Black mob, for example. And the same is true, I think, for many, many kinds of lower-class women's political activism. She offers a handful of powerful examples from fugitive slaves and Black abolitionist women in the 1850s. She doesn't say too much in this particular version about the evidence, but some of it, she tells us, is drawn from William Still's collection of narratives. Some of the stories she tells are well known: Celia, the Missouri slave, Margaret Garner, Harriet Tubman, but many others she mentions are not well known. Black women's militants, she makes it clear, came from a deep place, an American culture that had never afforded them, Black women, that is to say, the protections accorded true women, that is, white women. And there's obviously a great deal of truth to this, but I don't think we have to rely on idealized claims about true womanhood to establish that. There are many non-elite white women who also lacked gendered protection in the 19th century, and that protection was surrendered by practices of class and poverty. And some of them, those women, white working class women, were part of immigrant cultures of violent resistance that spilled over from places like Ireland to the United States, where they joined in actions, sometimes quite reactionary ones, in New York City streets, for example, during the draft riots. But Carter Jackson is tapping a very particular gender and racial formation here, and I really want to emphasize that. The otherness that attached to Blackness and womanhood in the 19th century, and made a willingness to use violence one of the necessary weapons of women who could not seek to be protected, but as she rightly says, instead had to become the protectors themselves. And this is a very, very valuable insight. I know she develops all these points in print at other points, so I don't want to belabor what she was able to convey in 20 minutes here. But listeners today might want to hear her say more about the framework that holds together this selection of profiles and actions, and also her thoughts on what kinds of political moments drive women to respond or act in this way. Even if the conditions of Black women's existence produce this positionality in the world, which she has convinced us it does, the decision to act on it in any given moment summons the tools of historians in their sensitivity to the particularity of context and temporal change. So I would be really interested in hearing your thoughts about that. So let me just wrap up by saying that taken together, these three papers present an opportunity to think in a macro way about what it means to enfold such diverse histories of Black resistance to enslavement in the category of war. So what does it mean to wrap them in the category of war? I have said myself, or written, that enslaved people were engaged in an ongoing war against slavery that clearly predated the American Civil War. So I'm indicting myself along with everyone else here. The formulation clearly captures something true about that long past, and it's valuable for the trueness that it brings to light. It has the obvious advantage. It has advantages. It has the obvious advantage of, let's be honest, seizing some of the status of wars as self-evidently significant historical events and attaching it to the history of people, women, Black women, generally written out and off as actors in those events. And for that reason, this is all good. But it also risks lumping diverse events together in a way that kind of sands off some of the very particularity we are striving to convey, particularity of conditions, of actors, of race, of gender under slavery, and then gender under compromised conditions of freedom, but also of actions, losing the distinction between actions that would be possible in formally declared wars, military conflicts waged, at least allegedly, under the rules, the international rules of war, as opposed to the kinds of conflicts that are continued to be regularly ongoing after the ends of wars when peace is formally declared, or in nationalist wars of liberation, or so forth, of which there are many, many kinds that we can look at. So what I'm trying to say here is that war is only one way to think about or categorize the kind of violent political conflicts under study here. Feminist scholars writing in contemporary human rights literature or engaged in activism under the rubric of women, peace, and security studies suggest other ways that might help us frame our analyses as well. And for a lot of those feminist political theorists and political scientists and human rights lawyers, they talk about zones of political conflict or conflict zones. And that's another sort of rubric that's like war, but without exactly the formality and practices of war. In some ways, makes the violence even more difficult to control. Finally, all of our paper givers press their conclusions in the direction of intellectual history, and I found this a very interesting aspect of the papers. Adam McNeil identifies his subject as a theorizer of freedom. Adam Thomas identifies Lucy as standing alongside Turner as he says, should we consider her as standing alongside Turner as a chief source of the revolt's ideology? And Professor Carter Jackson doesn't say so explicitly in this version, but her analysis poses questions of Black women's theory of resistance. Is the idea of protective violence Dr. Carter Jackson's, or does it come from women in the movement themselves? Or how did they think and write about their own patterns of resistance and history of resistance? These linkages to intellectual history claims strike me as more difficult to draw out, given the limits of the sources, particularly for the 19th century cases. And it leaves us with the question, which I started with, about how we can force revision in traditional fields like military history and intellectual history that have proven quite resistant to precisely the kinds of insights these authors' work represent. So I thank them for their papers, and because we've all been too greedy of our time, I'm going to look at the chat. Please put your questions in the chat, and if the panelists want, they can enfold responses to the suggestions I made in here. So let's see. Okay, so here we have a question from Abine Boyakwa Ansa. Adam McNeil, I loved your paper. Because I make similar arguments, I would like to hear you expound upon Black women as theorizers of freedom, the question I just posed. I agree entirely, but just want to hear your thoughts. And I'm interested in both Carter Jackson and Thomas's thoughts on this too. So this last question I posed about intellectual history and theorizers. So Adam McNeil, why don't you get us started? And then we'll turn it to Adam Thomas and Kellie Carter Jackson.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for the question. And yeah, I think that in terms of Koi's sister being a theorizer of freedom, it actually makes me think actually a bit about the sort of protective violence piece that Dr. Carter Jackson discussed, because when I think about what protection means and what it means that someone can pursue something like freedom, specifically, like we were talking about, Dr. McCurry, in terms of the particular context of war, where you don't know how long the conflict is going to be, right? Because the British had already been along the mid-Atlantic coast, or really along the Atlantic coast period, for about a year and some change already. So she had no idea at the end of 1814 whether or not she would actually get her freedom, but her words helped to protect her brother, who she thought would actually not gain his own freedom. So I think that theorizing freedom can actually mean you projecting that out without you actually being able to hold it in that moment, or you even pursue it in the similar way that she was pushing her brother and outright their friends too. So not to monopolize the time, so I'll just leave it at that. And Abina, would love to talk to you more, because I think you gave a great paper. I think you're at Vanderbilt too, so I'd love to talk to you more about that.
Adam Thomas?
Yeah, thank you, Abina. It's a really interesting question. In terms of Lucy as a theorizer of freedom, I think, if her ideology, or I guess conjure bags, and conjuration, on the one hand, it has these kind of very practical aims in the midst of warfare, but it is also an expression of beliefs, including, how society should be organized and moral economies. And so for me, I think Lucy's theorization of freedom, if she is a conjurer, comes most clearly in if the money that is part of the bag is specifically a way to target the Barrows. On the one hand, it is a practical kind of calling misfortune upon her enslavers, but on the other hand, I think it is a larger comment on sort of the immorality of slavery itself, right? The kind of the centrality of financial gain placed over people's well-being. And so I think that's the moment at which I see the nearest to what I would say Lucy kind of as a theorizer of freedom. I think there may be much more, but I'm kind of hesitant to, as we kind of been throughout this whole thing, I'm hesitant at how much I'm already speculating, but I think there certainly could be more if we could know more of exactly what she was intending. But thank you for a really good question.
Kellie?
Yeah, I'll be quick. I'll just say that nothing for me was more explicit than reading Amelia Robinson's op-ed. It was so clear about what her ideas, thoughts, intents were as it related to Charles Sumner's beating. And it's not often that I think you find sources like that are so clear and specific about what people want to do in response to a political controversy that has happened. That's not the norm. In most cases, I think scholars have to really do this difficult work of trying to tease out what people's intentions were, what their thoughts and ideas and motivations were for acting in a particular way. I think that what excites me the most about all of this scholarship is that I think I'm seeing, or our field is seeing, a wave of scholars that are trying to take the histories that we think we know or that we think we've covered and reread them again and sort of say, like, hold on, wait a second. Let's see if we can make sense of this silence, like Vanessa Holden is doing with the Southampton Rebellion. Let's see if we can take these one paragraph, sometimes one line, stories that we have about women and make sense of them, or at least make educated ideas about what we think might have happened, and give the reader a choice to say, like, this is what we know, this is what we don't know, but here's what's likely, and then go from there. And I think more of that work to me is just really exciting.
Well, I think we have time for one more question if anybody wants to post one, and if one doesn't come in, I'll give the time back to the presenters if they want to say. Please go ahead if there's any last thing you want to say to each other or about the subject.
So, Dr. Carter Jackson, I think you were talking about earlier Emily Foster and Mary Elizabeth being from Loudoun County, Virginia. Was that right? So the first thing I thought about was that if you go back to the last couple of weeks with the anti-critical race theory crowd in Northern Virginia, that's if I get my counties right, I think that is the actual county that they both Emily Foster and Mary Elizabeth would be from. So it's kind of interesting, right?
Yeah. And I think, is this the same county that was trying to ban Toni Morrison's beloved?
It just seems like there's so many, so it's probably right.
It's probably, which is also interesting because Toni Morrison's beloved is also based off of Margaret Garner. So there's a lot of connections. But yeah, I think, history is not very far from us.
I would say one thing that really interests me about all of this is how it remains a kind of third rail in American life that even with the gun rights movement absolutely unlimited in the United States, the idea of Black armed violence. This was, when I look at the Reconstruction work sources, one of the most common sources of violence against Black people was trying to get guns off of Black soldiers. And there's an irony there about what you're talking about, because the ownership of guns, which is a widely recognized American right, has never been widely acknowledged as a constitutional right Black Americans have a right to exercise. Would be an entirely different conversation around guns in this country, it seems to me, if the majority of gun owners were Black people pointing them at white people. So I think that that's arms, yeah.
And one last thing too, Dr. McCurry, I think this goes to the point of why incorporating local histories in our discussions at the secondary level is so important, because it's easy to project out the history to other places when an event like, you know, what happened with Emily Foster and Mary Elizabeth is a local historical story, right? And so, you know, so that's just something that I was just thinking. And to shamelessly plug Dr. Carol Anderson's book, The Second Race and Guns in a Fatally Unequal America. It's in the other side of the room. I was trying to cock my head to be able to see it.
Excellent book. It's an excellent book about the relationship between the Second Amendment and Black Americans.
Adam Thomas, do you want the last word?
I don't know. I'm happy to leave it there. Actually, I think yeah. Dr. Carter Jackson and Dr. in waiting McNeil have said it better than I can. But yeah, I just want to thank everyone for coming, and thank you for bearing with my tech issues and all that kind of stuff.
Well, let me just take this opportunity then to thank these three scholars for letting me have the privilege of reading their work and getting glimpses into new work that's coming. That's my favorite part about conferences. And to our audience who got up at 8 o'clock in the morning to join us here, we're deeply grateful. And I wish the three of you the best in your work going forward, and that sometime we'll get to meet in person. Thank you all so much.
Great. Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.